Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Messianic Bible Study. I apologize for this one being a little late. I had a malfunction with my technology, but I'm pretty sure I got it all figured out, so let us begin. Today we are starting in Genesis 29. And you can sort of tell what the malfunction is my computer is being very slow. I guess you wouldn't really call that a malfunction. It's just heavy load is on it. But anyway, we are continuing in the myth of Jacob. And we've talked a little bit about what myths are at this point. They're not a false story in any stretch of the imagination. They are a founding story. Myths can be real, they can be fake, they can that doesn't really matter. The category of myth or the genre of myth is a founding story, and it'll tell a bit of a morality. It'll give you a bit of a background into why we do this or why we do that, but that's what a myth is. So let's get started. Joseph. Genesis 39. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand, and fled, and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her house, and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me, and fled, and got out of the house." Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Now, we have a few things happening in this chapter. For instance, first of all, Joseph is placed in a very unfortunate and unfair situation. But this doesn't prevent him from actually performing his duties. He's a hard worker, he's intelligent, he's wise, he has the Spirit of God on him. The Lord blessed him, the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. And what this tells us is, even in this sort of situation, Joseph was sort of giving it his all. And as he was giving it his all, what happened was the Egyptians saw that. And he rose the ranks. He rose whatever sort of tiny little hierarchy he had as a slave and became the chief slave, like the head butler or whatever. And that's actually not a really bad place to be. And this really just tells something about, like, our lives. I mean, we could be in a variety of situations where we are in, like, let's say we're just in a really bad spot. And it's unfair because we didn't choose to be there. It just sort of was thrust upon us. We were dealt a bad hand, so to speak. But if we are wise, if we work hard, if we do what we're supposed to do and fulfill our duties, there could be anything, but there could not be a better way to act, regardless of where you are, to put you in a better position or a position primed for success. But we also have here a couple of archetypes that existed in those days. The first archetype is the two brothers. There's an old Egyptian story called The Two Brothers, and it's the way that the story goes is like this. There was an older brother and a younger brother. The older brother was married, and he had hired the younger brother to work in his tent. And so the younger brother loved his older brother, and he did everything that he did. He worked hard, he was wise, he was intelligent, and everything that he did for his older brother prospered. And then one day, the wife of the older brother casts her eyes upon the younger brother. And as this younger brother, he was going into the field one day, he has to pass by this cottage to get supplies. And what had happened was the wife of the older brother did herself up. She wanted to sleep with this guy. And she put makeup on, perfume, and then sat in the house and just waited. When the younger brother came into the house, he was like, "What are you doing here? And why are you all done up?" And he's confused. He's relatively innocent. And she comes on to him and says, "Well, I want to be with you." And he says, "This is a horrible thing. This cannot happen." And what happens then is he runs away. And so what she does then is she is embarrassed and distressed because of this. So she wipes up her makeup and pretends to cry, rips a little bit of her clothes, and when the older brother comes in, she says, "He came in to rape me." And the older brother, furious, of course, as you would be, starts chasing after the younger brother to kill him. And the gods, seeing the righteousness of the younger brother and the horrible place that has been placed upon him, sends a river to divide the two. So the younger brother is a little ahead of the older brother, and the gods send a river right in between the two, and it fills with crocodiles. And then they begin yelling at each other from across the river. The younger brother says, "Why are you chasing me?" And the older brother says, "Why did you run away?" And the younger brother says, "Because this happened." And then the older brother says, "You tried to rape my wife." And then the younger brother, furious that the older brother would think that this sort of thing would be possible, that he would imagine that this is something that he would do, decides to take a knife. He says, "I would never do that. I love you as my brother, So he takes a knife and chops off his private member and throws it in the river, and it's eaten by crocodiles. The older brother, seeing this display and becoming very distressed that his younger brother just cut his lineage off permanently with no recourse, realizes that the younger brother was not in the wrong here, and the wife was the one who was coming on to him. And so he goes home mourning and weeping and takes his wife and puts her to death. This is the story of the two brothers, and this is the archetype that Joseph, that's being portrayed by the Joseph and Potiphar story. It's not exactly the same, but it's one of those stories that is paralleled in the what would have been familiar in those days, in the days that Moses provided this to the people of Israel. And I mean, there's probably also a little bit of a... No, I'm not going to go there. Okay. So what this tells us is, first of all, this general theme of story is not exactly foreign or new to the people of Egypt and by extension the people of Israel. It's not foreign or new, but at the same time, that doesn't mean it's not true. That doesn't mean that this sort of thing hasn't happened. In fact, if Joseph was put into this sort of situation, and if he was familiar with the story, then he knows what's the best thing to do. How do I get out of this situation? I gotta run. So he begins running, but he doesn't have anywhere to run to. So he's not Moses in the Prince of Egypt. He is stuck. And so he just runs to his room. And Potiphar is unable to really fathom that his wife would be lying to him in this sort of situation. Like, why would she? And so he takes Joseph and throws him into prison. Another thing that is actually really interesting about this story, because I mentioned an episode or so ago that these stories also provide case law or provide wisdom for our day-to-day lives. So another thing that is really important to know about this is the bifurcation of feminine qualities. We've spoken about in the beginning, we spoke about how wisdom is a feminine quality. If you look for any sort of physical embodiment of wisdom, it would be a woman. And that's just sort of how the Bible is told. And in fact, if you read Proverbs, especially Proverbs 6 through 8, wisdom is entirely physically embodied by some sort of woman. But the great thing about wisdom here is that it is juxtaposed to the equally physically embodied female attribute of a harlot. This is sort of how the story goes, and throughout history, if you are looking at either the good side or the bad side of femalehood or womanhood, the good side is wisdom. If you want a wise counselor who will help you to understand your situation and how to move forward, then you go to a woman. And of course, you make the final decision, but even the kings in Israel, their chief counselor was their mothers or their wives, if their wives were particularly wise. But also, at the same time, what Proverbs tells us is that the destruction of a man is a foolish or is a adulterous woman. And it even talks about this adulterous woman, how she casts her eyes upon the foolish man who wanders in the streets, and she ensnares him into her house, saying, "My husband is on a faraway journey, and he'll never know." And Potiphar's wife is embodying that foolish woman. the evil side of womanhood. Now, there's a reason for this. Joseph is a little cocky. He's a little bit of a rascal. He's a little annoying. I mean, he's a little brother, so not all little brothers are annoying, but the defining characteristic, or one of the defining characteristics of a little brother, is that they're a little annoying. So he's a little cocky, even as a slave. And so he's seeing all this success. He's like, I'm a slave, but I'm still the best slave ever. And he says, where does it say it? So Potiphar left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. Now, Potiphar's wife, seeing this, casts her eyes upon Joseph. She sees him as a handsome man, but also a wise and hardworking man. He's probably, he's good in form and appearance, which is the same word that's used for Rachel, naturally, considering that he's the son of Rachel. So he's exotic, he is muscular, whatever you would see in a man, that this is what she sees in him. And not only that, but he's a wise person. And so this guy, being a little cocky, God gives him a problem that he cannot solve. And what's the reason for this? It's so God can humble him. So she says, lie with me. Now, pay attention to what he says here, because it's telling about his own character. He says, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house. So first of all, Joseph does not give glory to God. He says, because of me. He does talk about God, but it's at the end of what he's saying. God is more or less on the back end of his thoughts. So because of me, my master has no concern of anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except for you. Imagine a slave in those days, second in command in the house. He's the top slave, but he's still not greater than his master. Imagine a slave saying, my master, Potiphar, is not greater than me in any way. He doesn't understand the reality that he's experiencing. He thinks he is greater than himself. He's greater than he is. He has a delusion of grandeur. And so God, in order to use him, God has to humble him. And so God gives Joseph a dilemma. Potiphar's, does Joseph truly believe that he is equal to his master? Well, if he is, then Potiphar's wife is going to be a natural sort of thing for him to take. So God says, okay, let's allow Potiphar's wife to have these thoughts. And let's see what happens. So she casts her eyes on him, and when she does, and she says, lie with me, he has three options to test his wisdom. 1, sleep with her. This seems to be the cynical, but in all reality, it is a logical thing to do, because she'll probably keep her mouth shut. But at the same time, he might get caught. And he probably doesn't even think of her in this way. She's probably not his type. But at the very least, she'll get what she wants, and there won't be this sort of weird tension. Although there will be eventually in the end. But that's option 1. Option 2, tell the master what's going on. But then what's going to happen? He's going to tell the master, then the wife is going to say, no, actually, he tried to rape me. So Joseph is stuck in this position where he can't tell his master what's going on, because The natural conclusion for that is that the wife denies it and Joseph gets in trouble. Option number 3, say nothing. Reject Potiphar's wife and just go about business. Pretend nothing happened. Maybe she won't feel embarrassed and everything will just move on. So he goes with the wisest option, but it's still the option that doesn't work because his wisdom here is not enough. This is God testing him and humbling him. So his wisdom is not enough. So she keeps prodding him. She keeps coming after him. And he rejects her over and over again. He's like, this isn't working. She's not letting it go. And eventually she grabs hold of him. And he runs away, just like the younger brother. And the natural thing happens. She screams and claims that he came in trying to rape her. Now, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way that your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Potiphar sent Joseph to prison. Now, trying to rape a woman, especially a slave, trying to rape a noble woman, that's a capital offense in Egypt in those days. So Joseph gets put in the most precarious situation possible. At one point, he was secure and on his way up in the world. The highest possible position that you can get. And immediately, the next day, he's in prison awaiting death. But you do sort of get a hint at what Potiphar is thinking, because Joseph stays in prison for a long time. Now, today, of course, we don't think anything of that because we're like, yeah, well, people stay in prison for a long time. That's the thing. If you try to rape a woman, depending on the state that you're in, either you get the death penalty or you just go to life in prison. What's a big deal? Well, in those days, throughout the ancient Near East, but also in Egypt, a prison was not a place where we throw the undesirables and we keep them there. It's not like a quarantine facility like it is here today. In those days, a prison is a holding facility, awaiting trial to determine what happens next. So if you steal somebody, you don't get 5 years in prison, or however many years you get in prison today. If you steal something from somebody, depending on the value, you go to prison, and the judge gets ready to put you on trial. You go to trial, and the judge tells you how much you're going to pay back this person that you stole from. Or if you can't pay anything back, then you don't go back to prison. You are sold into slavery to the guy that you stole from in order to pay back what you stole. And there's a certain time period that you would be a slave in this sense. If you did something that was more serious, a capital offense, then you get put in prison. And then after a period, you die. They put you to death. Or if you are accused of something, you get put in prison awaiting trial, then you go to trial and they determine that you're innocent, then you get let free. That's sort of how the justice system works in those days. And of course, Moses or Joseph is an example of how even in that sort of structure, you get people that kind of slip through the cracks. And there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. And Joseph is one of these people. But what you do see is Potiphar never presses charges. He sort of just leaves him in there. You get an understanding, like this is a little hint into Potiphar's thinking. He probably knows secretly that his wife is the one that came onto Joseph. But not wanting to embarrass his wife, well, probably less likely that, and more likely not wanting to be dishonored amongst everybody. He probably wanted to keep it quiet. And in order to keep it quiet, but also in order to not put to death an innocent man, what you have to do is throw him in prison and just never press charges. Because it looks like you're doing something, but also you're not actually doing it. So Potiphar probably knew. But it's better for Joseph to rot in prison for 5 years or so, or for the rest of his life, than for Potiphar to be put to shame in any way. That's sort of what we learn from this chapter. One more thing that we do learn is how God deals with Gentiles. And this is something that I first found in a chapter in Matthew. I forgot which one, but it's the one where Jesus says, if somebody welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet, then they receive a prophet's reward. And if somebody welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person, they receive a righteous person's reward. The idea here is that God has his family, and he deals directly with his family. So if you're in the family, then you're in. If you're outside of the family, it's a little more ambiguous what happens. Joseph is in the family. He's descended from Abraham. He is the son of Jacob. He's in the family. He's in the covenant family. Now, God can deal with Joseph on a much more intimate level, saying, okay, well, I'm going to punish you more directly than I would somebody else, or I'm going to bless you more directly than I would somebody else, dependent almost entirely on your actions. How God deals with Gentiles, or people who are outside of the family, is more dependent on how those people deal with, or how those people relate to those who are in the family, and less dependent on their own individual actions, although he still judges them according to their own individual actions. So, Amos, for instance, there's this prophecy in Amos where God is railing against Tyre, he's railing against Egypt, he's railing against Moab, he's railing against Bashan, all of these Gentile nations, and he's accusing them of very specific crimes that they committed amongst themselves, intrapersonal crimes. But at the same time, most of the time when he is destroying other nations and judging them in the Old Testament, it's because they did something to his people. Tyre, for instance, when they were friends with David, they were blessed. God blessed them. When Tyre stopped being friends with Israel, God began to destroy them. Edom, when they were friends with Jacob, God blessed them. And then in Obadiah, when Edom was standing around while his brother Jacob was being killed by Nebuchadnezzar, God said, I'm going to destroy you because of this. It's because of what you did to your brother Jacob that you're being destroyed. And this is sort of how God's sort of family structure works. Abraham's descendants and Isaac's and Jacob's descendants are sort of righteous. They're just made righteous, declared righteous, so to speak, in this paradigm. And it's less, like righteous is kind of a weird term to use for it, but it's more like they're in the covenant. And when Christians talk about righteousness, that's really what they mean, is you're in the covenant. So the descendants of Jacob are in the covenant. And so those who treat an in-covenant person, an in-the-family person, as somebody, like they treat them well because they're in the family, then those people receive the reward of somebody inside the family. And we see that here in this chapter. It says, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. This is fulfilling the prophecy to Abraham. Those who bless you, I will bless. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. And that's just something that this chapter demonstrates. It's sort of disconnected, but this is one of those common themes that you see throughout the Old Testament, is is the person who receives a righteous person as a righteous person receives a righteous person's reward. And that's part of the general doctrine, the general theology of the Old Testament. Okay, Genesis 40, moving to the next chapter. Joseph is in prison, and it begins, "Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Now, this is one of those chapters that gets Egyptologists thinking that even if this stuff didn't happen, even if it was a work of fiction, or they say either this stuff did happen and this was just a recounting of history, or if it didn't happen, then the story was written, this work of fiction was written by somebody who was intimately familiar with ancient Egyptian culture. Because of this whole dream thing. The ancient Egyptians had like thousands of volumes. They had libraries full of spells, rituals, and interpretations for dreams. They found dreams to be really important. And actually, most cultures found dreams to be significant. If you go to Egypt, to Babylon, to Syria, you find stories of people getting omens from the gods through dreams. And the reason is because there's sort of an ancient idea that when you are asleep, you're like half dead. And of course, they have a different conception of death than us. It's not like you're closer to death. It's more like your spirit is not entirely in its body. And what that means is you are open. You have greater access to the spiritual world, and the gods can more freely, without the hindrances from your own personal mind and will give you information. And so naturally, if that is your premise of what dreams are, then naturally you're going to want to build a science around that, and that's what the Egyptians tried to do. However, most Egyptians required volumes and days in order to deal with a dream, in order to figure out its interpretation. So the curious thing about Joseph is that he just knows. He's a prophet. And that's something that is unique about him, especially to an Egyptian. So, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. Now, you normally would not want to get rid of your cupbearer if you were a king. And the reason is because they are the CEO of your entire kingdom. They are the chief administrator. Like most people, they think of monarchies in sort of like an autocratic top-down rule sort of thing, which there is to some degree that sort of governmental style there. But in a monarchy, in the actual monarchies that we see, the king didn't actually do very much. He had legislators do the lawmaking. He had the chief cupbearer or his second in command or some council doing the actual administration of the nation. The king just sort of had more of like a he was the highest authority in the land, and so he could just he could make a law if he wanted, but most of the time he didn't. He would travel into battle. He could just say somebody needs to get their tongue cut out or needs to have their head chopped off. Like, he could just say that, and people would have to follow the orders. But most of the time he didn't. That's just not the reality of the situation. That's the theory, but the theory almost never actually was implemented or in any sort of practical sense put into place. So the chief cupbearer is the chief administrator. It's a bad idea for you to just fire your chief administrator. And so the reason that the Pharaoh did this is he probably suspected the cupbearer of some sort of rebellion or coup. And he probably suspected the baker to be in on it. How do you know? Well, baker's going to poison you, and the chief cupbearer, he's going to know where the poison is. So, Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. And of course, Joseph was placed in authority over them as they were in prison. Now, they both dreamed dreams. Now, this is another place where we get a little glimpse into Joseph's annoying, his little, being a little rascal, a little cocky, uncaring about people's feelings, because he's like, the cupbearer has a good dream, and Joseph is like, in 3 days, you're gonna have your head lifted up, and you're going to be put back into your original position. And then the baker, he's like, oh, maybe my dream's good too. So he goes and asks him about it, and Joseph says, yes, your head will be lifted up from off of you. Like, there's no reason, if you are at all sensitive to how other people feel, there's no reason to make this poetic. There's no reason to connect these two things. Joseph was just a bit of a rascal. He was a bit of an insensitive jerk. And so God, the reason he's in prison is because God's trying to humble him out of that. And so naturally, that's what happens. Now, the really interesting thing here is Pharaoh suspected the chief baker of something really heinous. And how do we know that? Because he was hung. The Bible, like, we know what the Bible says. Cursed is the person who hangs on a tree. And that's not God just making that up. That's how people believed, and it's true. Like, they had a true belief in those days. But the real important thing here is that Joseph says birds are going to eat your flesh from you. Meaning the chief baker is not going to get a burial. Which is religiously very important. To give you some sort of context for that, I just read two of Sophocles' plays. One of them is called Ajax, and another one's called the Antigone. In the Antigone, this is the daughter of Oedipus, and she has a sister and two brothers. And Oedipus and Antigone and her sister are exiled. And then eventually, the older brother, because Oedipus was the king of this town, the older brother takes the place of Oedipus because he's next in line. And he's a good king. He's sane. And he gives justice to those who are in his kingdom. However, his younger brother is crazy. He's psycho. And so his younger brother eventually chases out the older brother, and the younger brother takes his place, and he begins ruling the kingdom like a tyrant. So the older brother comes to Oedipus and says, please return and help us to bring order to the kingdom, and if you're on my side, then we will be able to talk some sense into the younger brother over there. And Oedipus refuses. And so what happens is the two brothers, they go at it with each other in war, and they kill each other. Now Creon, the best friend of Oedipus, who was sort of put in charge of his children when Oedipus was sent into exile, Creon, he was supposed to take care of these kids, and he doesn't do that great of a job. They just went and killed each other, and the two girls were sent into exile, so he's not doing that great of a job. But now he's king, because Creon is technically next in line. I think he was related to Oedipus in some way, but I forgot how. But one thing that he says is the younger brother, the crazy one, cannot be buried. And this is a terrible, terrible thing. This is very dramatic way to punish somebody, to not give them their burial rights, to dishonor them after they die. And this crazy psycho king who probably did like some really horrible tyrannical things, he like killed a bunch of people, he gets Creon says that he cannot be buried. Now Antigone, she is really upset about this, so she goes and tries to protect him, to bury him. So she does. And the messengers come to Creon, and this is a capital offense because Creon said that if you try to bury him, then I'm going to put you to death. They bring Antigone to Creon, and he says, well, I guess I'm going to put you to death. Now, unbeknownst to, well, no. So Creon had provided Antigone to his own son for marriage. And so when Antigone is then put into prison awaiting death, his own son comes up to him and he gives him an ultimatum. He says, okay, you made this rule, but in the end, this was a wicked rule. Now, if you want to be a wise and righteous king, you're going to have to go against your own rule, because the gods do not look kindly on this dishonor of the dead. And eventually, the way that the story ends, spoiler alert, is that the moral of the story is that, the gods don't look kindly on this dishonor of the dead. And the same thing happens in Ajax, another one of Sophocles' play, is the same, let's say, moral of the story applies. So, those people, according to these plays and according to the tenor of morality in those days, do not deserve to be dishonored after death. It was a very serious crime to dishonor somebody after death, or at least they had to have committed a very serious offense. And of course, you don't have an exact translation, but that does give us a little bit of an understanding into an ancient person's mind regarding the honor of the dead. For the baker, first of all, to be hung, which is a dishonor, it's a curse on them. First of all, to be hung, and then to be left there for 3 days. That's something that you give to a foreign king that you defeated in battle, for instance. That's a Philistine, that's a barbarian thing to do. That's a thing that the Philistines did to King Saul. But the baker, apparently, the Pharaoh saw what the baker did as something so heinous that he has to do this. Now, the spiritual side of this is actually pretty important to understand as well. In order for, in Egyptian theology, in order for you to safely pass on to the next life, you first of all have to be buried a specific way. Like, it has been Egyptian theology has been aptly called a death cult. Like, everything you do in your life is leading to death. To, like all of your good deeds are weighed in the balance in front of Osiris, for instance. So it's leading to death. And then when you die, you have a huge funeral, a complicated ritualistic funeral that makes it so that you are embalmed the proper way. You're given a proper set of spells and prayers to ward off the demons that are going to be coming after your soul because they think it's tasty. And it'll help you fight them off. You get passwords so you can get through the guardians, and different gods are going to try to keep you away or trick you and that sort of thing. And so they give you this book or a set of spells for you to memorize before you die. And then if you're a pharaoh or you're somebody who's particularly important, they inscribe all of this on your tomb so that you don't even have to memorize it. Yeah, you probably want to, but then you just look all around in your tomb and you figure out the roadmap to the next life. So, for none of that to happen for the baker, they're basically saying, first of all, we will dishonor you in death. We will not care for your body. You're not going to get you're not going to get embalmed. You're not going to get a funeral. And we're not even going to let you be reincarnated. We're going to make it the most difficult for you to get into the next life. What we want for you is to die into oblivion and lose your soul. It's a really horrible thing to do to somebody, in other words. And that's what they did to this chief baker. Because apparently what he did was, or what he was suspected of doing, was incredibly heinous. And most likely it was some sort of rebellion against the king to try to put the king to death, which was a serious, heinous crime in those days. And so one of these things that we can learn from this story is it's good to just be humble. Because so many of our troubles come from us not being humble, from thinking we're a little too proud, or speaking to our brothers or to those around us in a haughty or sarcastic or rude or the way that you speak to somebody if you're a jerk. And those types of people, if they're truly God's children, if they're truly in the family, God is going to humble them and refine them in order for him to work through them at some point. And that's what we get here. This is what the story of Joseph in prison tells us, is if we don't humble ourselves, God will humble us. But fortunately, all things work together for the good of those who love the Lord. So, chapter 41. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows in the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep, and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after they sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted. After them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears, and I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah. And he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it, and Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, "For," he said, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." The name of the second he called Ephraim, "For God had made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to do, do." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Pharaoh, or to Joseph, to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. Okay, there's a decent amount to unpack here. So after these 2 full years of Joseph being humbled, he's finally ready. God has finally deemed him ready to enter into the position that God actually has for him. That is, well, and he required that humility ahead of time because he is going to be the second in command of all of Egypt. Now, I talked a little bit about the governmental structure of a monarchy. Oftentimes, the chief cupbearer is second in command. But oftentimes, in between Pharaoh and the chief cupbearer is this regent character, and this is what Joseph becomes. He is he is second in he is Pharaoh in Pharaoh's place, essentially, and he's in charge of everything that the people have. And oftentimes, when you have a monarchy, a wise king will understand when there's somebody wiser than him who can actually perform all of these administrative duties, and he will step aside and he'll go race his horses, he'll go fight his lions, he'll do the things that he wants to do, but there will be this chief administrator to basically run all of the complicated things. And that's what Joseph essentially becomes. Now, I'm not going to break down these 7 cows. I know a lot of people have built their own volumes of dream interpretation books from a biblical perspective or something along those lines. But the important thing about the cows here is that they're foreign. This dream is not something that the Egyptians had in their books, or at least the interpretations were confusing enough for them to not know what to do with it. And another really important thing is the wind that has sort of made these that has scorched these ears of grain is from the east. And what this tells ultimately Pharaoh is that the God who's in charge of this event that's going to happen is not Egypt's God. It is a God from the east. And we know which God that is. It's the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob, who at this time is east of Egypt, east of the Nile. It's a foreign God that's coming in and doing this. And so this dream, the interpretation thereof, is exotic. And it requires somebody who is well versed in the ways of this God in order to tell the Egyptians what's going to happen. And so Joseph, of course, understanding that this entire situation is a severe misunderstanding of who God is, nonetheless, he understands that they have their ways. At the very least, he can save life, and he can explain what this interpretation of this dream is, which would be singular and idiosyncratic to this particular situation. If you have a dream of cows, and you read in some book somewhere that these cows mean one thing or another because of some sort of interpretation of Genesis 41, probably wrong. Probably wrong. Like, don't worry about that sort of stuff. But in this particular situation, Pharaoh is presented with a foreign dream given by a foreign god, and he needs a foreigner to explain it, an Asiatic to explain it. And that's how the Hyksos and probably a subgroup of the Hyksos, the Hebrews, were seen in Egyptian history. They were seen as Asiatics, and they were painted differently. So they needed these Asiatics to explain, or this particular wise Asiatic to explain how this dream should be interpreted, because it's a foreign god that's giving it to them, and a god that they have no idea, like, really anything about this god, because not only is he Asiatic, but he is one of the gods of an obscure Asiatic group that is in, like, etymologically sometimes seemingly confused with the Canaanite gods, but also distinct. This is an obscure god for the Egyptian pharaoh, because first of all, the Asiatics, the people in the wilderness, they're sort of seen as like savages. It'd be like Christopher Columbus coming here and trying to figure out the gods of the Native Americans. He's like, they're weird, I don't know. I have no idea. That's sort of how Pharaoh viewed these Asiatic gods, and therefore it's obscure. Not only is it obscure, but it's an obscure god from the obscure gods that he would be just entirely unfamiliar with. And so it requires a very special person to help interpret this dream, in other words. And so Joseph is the person that is able to interpret this dream for him. And not only this, he gives the solution to the problem. We get a couple things here. First of all, one of the things Joseph says is that the dream is doubled, which means it's fixed. What this tells us about God is that prophecy itself is not always fixed. This is something that's really important. Prophecy is not always fixed, and we see this throughout the Old Testament. Jonah goes out to all the people and he says God's going to overthrow the city in 40 days. Now, the meaning is he's going to destroy the city. You get people trying to find loopholes in the prophecy, but the meaning is he's going to overthrow the city. They repent, and it doesn't happen. So, is God wrong? No. It's just that prophecy, especially negative prophecy, is almost always contingent on repentance. If you repent, then you can forego the negative prophecy. If you don't repent, well, the prophecy is going to come about. And this gets into sort of a Jewish theological idea. The goodness of God is irrevocable. The badness of God is revocable. So if God makes a promise, he's never going to go back on the promise because he's a good God. This is the omnibenevolence attribute. But if he makes a bad promise, that is, if the promise is to destroy something, take for example Josiah or Solomon or Hezekiah, he promises he's going to destroy Israel. And then you get a good king, and he says, okay, never mind, I'm going to destroy it later. Next generation. And presumably, if Josiah's son was also righteous, then God would prolong it again. And if you had a string of righteous kings, perhaps you could turn the entire thing around. And this is what happens with Moses at the sin of the golden calf. God says, I'm going to destroy the people. God says, please don't do that. Moses says, please don't do that. So God says, okay, fine. He keeps revoking the negative promise that he made. However, God is sovereign. He's king. So if he says something's going to happen, and he really says something is going to happen, then you can't revoke it. And this is why Joseph, he interprets the doubling of the dream as saying that this is something set in stone. This is prophecy sealed with the seal of God, and not even God is going to revoke it. But that's an important thing for us to understand. The second really important thing, and this gets into sort of like a difference in regime style, this would never be able to happen in a democracy. Nobody, if the president said, yeah, this guy I just pulled out of prison told me that I had a dream, and the dream is saying that there's going to be a state of emergency in 7 years, so therefore I need to increase taxes and put this guy in charge of every step that you take, like every little bit of your life. Can you imagine the riots? Could you imagine the litigation, the appeals to remove this guy from government because he's crazy? But in a monarchy, and this gets into like the Pharaoh hypothetically, theoretically has the power to do this, he just normally doesn't. Because it's a monarchy, the Pharaoh can just do this. And the hope is the Pharaoh is listening to divine wisdom here. If he's not, then you're like, well, he's just crazy. But what Joseph does here is he says, increase taxes to 20% and save it. There's another question, because what ends up happening, a little bit of spoilers here. What ends up happening is when the times of famine come, Pharaoh's the only place that has food. So all of the other people have to come to him for bread, so much so that they sell all their, or like they use up all their money buying food, then they sell all their livestock, then they sell their property, then finally they sell themselves into slavery. And the question is why? And the answer is this: they didn't save. When times of plenty came, they ate up their food. They partied. They used it. When times of famine came, they did not reduce the amount of partying or utilization of food enough. So they used up all their money. They sold all their property. They sold all of their land, And finally, they sold themselves into slavery. And this is how Pharaoh became the absolute monarch that he was during the times of the next couple pharaohs. Until, he became an absolute tyrant in that sense. Because before that, the people were free. They were free men. And after that, they were all slaves. And that gets into just something that really is more about wisdom. Reading the Proverbs, if they had Proverbs and they listened to it and obeyed it, they wouldn't have had the problem that they had. Everybody knew. Somebody was like, okay. Somebody came out, said, hey, we're increasing all your guys' taxes by 20%. Everyone's like, wait, why? This is our stuff. You can't just do that. Then he says, well, there's this prophecy that in 7 years, no food is going to be produced at all. And then they're just like, okay. They don't save. If they truly, if they believed this prophecy, they should have been saving. And even if they didn't, they should have been saving. You should always have some level of preparation for cataclysmic circumstances. Some level. It's like, if you're good with money, you'll have as excess savings in a rainy day fund 2 or 3 months of rent or of all your bills, just in your savings. And that's what you're supposed to do. Now, of course, these people, if they had 2 or 3 months of savings, and that wouldn't have been enough, but at the very least, if they understood that this disaster was coming in 7 years, that's enough time for themselves to put 20% aside and live off of the 60% that was still left to them. Cut back a little bit on your intake so you can save right alongside Pharaoh in your own storehouses. But no. From the beginning, they decided that if Pharaoh has the grain, then we'll go to him for the grain. And they abdicated responsibility, which means they abdicated freedom. And this is the same thing for us today. When we abdicate responsibility, when all we do is seek rights and seek our own good without actually wanting to put in the effort, then we abdicate our freedoms. And this is why one of the founding fathers of America, they said that this democracy only works with a religious and moral people. And part of being religious is informing yourself of why we exist in the sort of state that we do, in the free state that we do. This is called a liberal education. Inform yourself of the arguments, of the types of governments that are out there, of the reasons why our government is constituted in the way that it is, and then look at multiple sides of it and make a free decision. If you don't do that, if you don't set yourself up to understand your own governmental system and take responsibility to alter it through the voting mechanisms that we have, then you're just going to lose your freedoms. And it's not because of anything that someone else did. It's not an unfair thing that has been put upon you. It's because from the beginning you abdicated responsibility, and therefore from the beginning you abdicated your freedom. And this is what ultimately the story of Joseph teaches us. There's one more quick little thing. This isn't the first time this 7-year famine thing happened. And this is why we know that this dream was actually very specific and very different from the types of dreams that pharaohs have had before. It's because they recorded, most likely, the dreams that would have come to Amenhotep, who was the person who this other 7-year famine happened a few hundred years prior to. And Amenhotep, if I remember right, was actually a pharaoh. And I know there are a couple theories out there that he was either a pharaoh or he was just a really powerful person. And we even have some sort of like mythological stories about him who, like, apparently he was this pre-Hippocrates, like he was a medical scientist, he was an anatomist, he was a magician of the highest order. Maybe. I haven't looked enough into it, but the point is this 7-year famine thing has happened before, and we know that this is a foreign dream given by a foreign god because this dream did not match the previous one. And therefore, you needed a foreigner to interpret it. And I think that's it for me today in this episode of Messianic Bible Study. I hope that you guys, the former day saints, have enjoyed this. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, then please write them below. Hope you have a really good day. Bye.